Marcus Thompson had served the royal family for 15 years. Every morning at exactly 5:30 a.m., he would put on his crisp uniform, polish his shoes until they gleamed, and take his position at the palace gates. For 15 years, he had been the model of loyalty and discretion. But today was different. Today, Marcus sat in his small apartment above the bakery on Crown Street, staring at a manila envelope that would change everything. The envelope contained photographs, documents, and audio recordings that painted a picture so shocking, so corrupt, that Marcus had spent sleepless nights wondering if he was making the right choice. Inside were bank statements showing millions of pounds flowing into offshore accounts, photographs of secret meetings between palace officials and foreign dignitaries, and recordings of conversations that revealed the true nature of the power struggle happening behind the palace's golden walls. Marcus remembered the exact moment when everything changed. It was 3 months ago, during the annual charity gala. He had been assigned to guard the private study where high-ranking officials often retreated for confidential discussions. The thick oak doors were supposed to be soundproof, but there was a small gap near the hinges that allowed voices to carry into the hallway where Marcus stood. The Queen must never find out about the arms deal, a familiar voice had whispered urgently. Marcus recognized it immediately as Lord Chancellor William Hartwell, the Queen's most trusted advisor. If she discovers we've been selling weapons to both sides of the conflict, it will destroy everything we've worked for. Another voice, which Marcus later identified as Defense Minister Rebecca Sterling, responded with equal urgency. The payments have been going through for 6 months now. We're talking about £2 billion, William. There's no way to hide this forever. Marcus felt his blood run cold. Arms deals? £2 billion? This wasn't just corruption. This was treason. The royal family's reputation, built over centuries, was being destroyed by the very people sworn to protect it. Over the following weeks, Marcus began to pay closer attention. He noticed how certain officials would arrive at odd hours, how documents were being shredded in unprecedented quantities, and how the Queen herself seemed increasingly isolated from her own advisors. The elderly monarch, who had dedicated her entire life to serving her country, was being betrayed by those closest to her. The breakthrough came when Marcus discovered that the palace's security system kept detailed logs of all electronic communications. As head of the night security detail, he had access to these systems during his rounds. What he found was a web of encrypted messages between palace officials and arms dealers, energy companies, and even representatives from countries under international sanctions. One particular exchange made Marcus's hands shake as he read it. Lord Chancellor Hartwell had written to an unknown recipient. The old woman is becoming suspicious. We may need to consider accelerating our timeline. The succession plans we discussed must be implemented before she starts asking too many questions. The old woman was clearly the Queen, and the casual disrespect in that phrase made Marcus sick to his stomach. These people were supposed to serve her to protect the crown and everything it represented. Instead, they were plotting against her while she trusted them completely. Marcus began secretly documenting everything. Using his security clearance, he copied financial records, photographed documents, and even managed to record several conversations using a small device he had purchased with his own money. The evidence painted a clear picture. A group of high-ranking officials had been systematically stealing from the royal treasury, using their positions to broker illegal deals, and planning to manipulate the line of succession for their own benefit. The most damning evidence came from Lord Chancellor Hartwell's private computer. During one of his security rounds, Marcus noticed that Hartwell had left his office unlocked and his computer running. The screen showed an email draft that made Marcus's blood run cold. The Queen's health is declining faster than expected. Our sources and a medical team confirm that she has at most 18 months. We must ensure that Prince Edward never takes the throne. His investigation into the Treasury irregularities could expose everything. The Duke of Cambridge's gambling debts make him far more manageable. A few strategic revelations about Edward's past could remove him from succession entirely. Marcus realized he was looking at evidence of a conspiracy that went to the very heart of the monarchy. These weren't just corrupt officials stealing money. They were actively working to manipulate who would become the next king. They were planning to destroy Prince Edward's reputation and elevate someone they could control through blackmail and financial pressure. The weight of what Marcus had discovered was crushing. He had sworn an oath to protect the royal family, but How could he protect them when the threat came from within? Who could he trust when the very people who should be safeguarding the monarchy were the ones trying to destroy it? For weeks, Marcus wrestled with his conscience. He thought about his wife, Sarah, his two young daughters, and the quiet life they had built together. Going public with this information would destroy that life forever. He would face criminal charges for accessing classified information, death threats from powerful people who wanted to keep their secrets buried, and the constant fear that came with challenging some of the most influential figures in the country. But every time he considered staying silent, Marcus thought about the Queen. He had met her personally several times during his years of service, and he had been struck by her genuine dedication to her people. She worked tirelessly well into her 90s, reading every briefing, attending every ceremony, and carrying out her duties with a grace and dignity that inspired everyone around her. The idea that the people she trusted most were betraying her was unbearable. The final straw came when Marcus overheard a conversation between Defense Minister Sterling and an unidentified man in the palace gardens. They were discussing plans to leak false information about Prince Edward's military service, claiming he had been involved in covering up civilian casualties during his deployment in Afghanistan. The story was completely fabricated, but they had forged documents and bribed witnesses to make it seem authentic. Once this breaks, Sterling had said with a cold smile, Edward will have no choice but to abdicate his position in the line of succession. The Duke of Cambridge will be so grateful for our support during his brother's disgrace that he'll do whatever we ask once he becomes king. That night, Marcus made his decision. He contacted investigative journalist Helena Price, whose reputation for fearless reporting and absolute integrity was known throughout the country. Helena had exposed corruption in Parliament, brought down corrupt judges, and even uncovered a major scandal involving defense contractors. If anyone could handle evidence this explosive, it was her. The meeting was arranged for the following Tuesday at a small cafe in Westminster. Marcus arrived 30 minutes early, his heart pounding as he clutched the manila envelope containing copies of everything he had discovered. He watched every person who entered the cafe, wondering if any of them might be working for the people he was about to expose. Helena arrived exactly on time, a tall woman with graying hair and sharp, intelligent eyes. She sat across from Marcus and studied his face carefully before speaking. "Mr. Thompson," she said quietly, "I need you to understand what you're getting into. If what you've told me over the phone is true, this story will change everything. Are you prepared for that?" Marcus looked down at the envelope, then back at Helena's serious expression. "I've been preparing for 15 years, he said. "I took an oath to protect the crown, and that's exactly what I'm doing." Helena opened the envelope and began examining its contents. As she looked through the documents, her expression grew increasingly grave. After nearly an hour of careful review, she looked up at Marcus with a mixture of admiration and concern. "This is the biggest story of the decade," she said simply. "But you know they'll come after you with everything they have. Your life will never be the same." Marcus nodded. He had already made peace with that reality. "The Queen deserves to know the truth," he said. "The country deserves to know the truth. Whatever happens to me after that is secondary." That evening, Marcus returned home to find Sarah waiting for him in their small kitchen. She could see immediately that something was wrong, and when he told her everything, she was quiet for a long time. Finally, she reached across the table and took his hand. "I married a man of integrity," she said softly. "I want to ask you to change now." The next morning, Helena called to inform Marcus that her legal team had verified the authenticity of the documents and that the newspaper's lawyers had cleared the story for publication. The headline would read, "Royal Guard leaks explosive evidence. A palace power struggle heads to court." As Marcus prepared for what would be his final day as a Royal Guard, he felt a strange sense of peace. For months, the weight of keeping these secrets had been crushing him. Soon, that burden would be shared with the entire nation. The truth would finally be revealed, and justice could begin. He had no illusions about what lay ahead. There would be investigations, legal battles, and probably years of court proceedings. His quiet life was over forever. But as he looked at the photograph of the Queen on his dresser, the same photograph that hung in guard stations throughout the palace, Marcus knew he had made the right choice. The monarchy would survive this scandal, but only because someone had been brave enough to expose the cancer growing within it. Marcus Thompson, a simple guard who had served faithfully for 15 years, was about to become the man who saved the crown by nearly destroying it. The newspaper hit the stands at exactly 6 a.m. on Thursday morning. By 6:15 a.m., every major news outlet in the country was scrambling to confirm the story. By 7 a.m., the palace gates were surrounded by reporters, photographers, and television crews from around the world. The headline that Marcus Thompson had dreaded and anticipated for months was now blazing across every screen and newspaper stand in the nation. Helena Price stood in the newsroom of The Guardian, watching the chaos unfold on multiple television screens. Her phone hadn't stopped ringing since the story broke. News directors from CNN, BBC, Sky News, and dozens of other outlets were all demanding interviews, confirmations, and follow-up stories. But Helena's attention was focused on a different kind of response: the immediate and coordinated effort to discredit both her and Marcus Thompson. The first attack came within hours. Social media accounts that had been dormant for months suddenly came alive with posts questioning Marcus's mental health, his financial situation, and his motives. Anonymous sources began feeding information to rival newspapers suggesting that Marcus had gambling debts, that he had been passed over for promotion multiple times, and that he had a history of making false allegations against his supervisors. "They're moving fast," Helena's editor, James Morrison, observed as he watched the character assassination unfold in real time. "This level of coordination doesn't happen by accident. They had a crisis management plan ready to go." Helena nodded grimly. She had expected this response, but seeing it happen so quickly and efficiently was still shocking. Within 6 hours of publication, 3 different news outlets had run stories suggesting that Marcus Thompson was a disgruntled employee seeking revenge, that the documents could have been fabricated, and that the whole story was an elaborate hoax designed to destabilize the monarchy during a particularly sensitive time. Meanwhile, Marcus sat in a safe house that Helena's newspaper had arranged for him and his family. The small apartment in South London was a far cry from their comfortable home above the bakery, but it was secure and anonymous. Sarah sat beside him on the worn sofa, holding their 2 daughters close as they watched their father's face appear on television screen after television screen. "Daddy, why are all these people talking about you?" asked Emma, their 8-year-old daughter, her voice filled with confusion and worry. Marcus struggled to find words that would make sense to a child. How could he explain that sometimes doing the right thing meant that powerful people would try to hurt you? How could he help his daughters understand that their quiet, normal life was over forever? "Sometimes grown-ups do bad things," he said finally, pulling Emma onto his lap. "And when someone tries to stop them, those grown-ups get very angry and say mean things about the person who told the truth." The television showed footage of the palace, where an emergency meeting was clearly taking place. Black cars with tinted windows arrived and departed throughout the morning, and palace officials could be seen moving quickly between buildings. The official statement from the palace was brief and predictable. "We are aware of the allegations made in today's newspaper. These claims are currently being investigated through appropriate channels." But behind the palace walls, the reality was far more chaotic. Lord Chancellor William Hartwell paced frantically in his private office, his phone pressed to his ear as he spoke in urgent, hushed tones to someone on the other end. Defense Minister Rebecca Sterling sat across from him, her face pale and drawn as she watched news coverage on her laptop. "How did this happen?" Sterling demanded when Hartwell ended his call. "Thompson was a nobody, a night guard who barely spoke to anyone. How did he get access to this information?" Hartwell loosened his tie, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool morning air. "He had security clearance for the electronic systems," he said. "We never thought anyone would actually use those access codes to investigate. It was supposed to be routine maintenance and monitoring." The 2 officials were interrupted by a sharp knock on the door. Prince Edward entered without waiting for permission, his face thunderous with anger. At 45, the prince was known for his military bearing and direct manner, qualities that had made him both respected and feared within palace circles. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice dangerously calm, "I believe we need to have a conversation about the future of your positions here." Sterling and Hartwell exchanged worried glances. They had known this moment would come, but they had hoped to control the narrative before facing any direct confrontation from the royal family. "Your Highness," Hartwell began carefully, "these allegations are completely unfounded. We're dealing with a disgruntled employee who stopped." Prince Edward's command cut through the room like a blade. I've spent the last 4 hours reviewing the documents that this newspaper obtained. I've had my personal staff verify the authenticity of the bank records, the communications, and the transaction logs. Everything in that story is true, isn't it? The silence that followed was answer enough. Prince Edward walked to the window and looked out at the crowd of reporters gathering outside the gates. His jaw was tight with barely controlled rage. 23 years of military service, he said quietly. 23 years of serving my country, of leading men and women into combat, of making decisions that cost lives and saved lives. And you two thought you could manipulate me like some kind of puppet. Sterling found her voice first. Edward, you have to understand the pressure we're under. The public finances, the changing political landscape, the need to modernize the monarchy's approach to modernize. Prince Edward turned from the window, his eyes blazing. You call stealing £2 billion from the Treasury modernizing? You call planning to destroy my reputation with fabricated war crimes modernizing? You call plotting to manipulate the line of succession modernizing? Hartwell stood up slowly, his face grave. Your Highness, perhaps we should discuss this privately. There are things you don't understand about the complexities of running a modern monarchy. The only thing I don't understand, Prince Edward said with deadly quiet, is how two people I trusted with my family's legacy could betray everything we represent. Across London, Helena Price was preparing for what would be the most important press conference of her career. The small conference room at the Guardian's headquarters was packed with journalists from around the world, all demanding answers about the source of the story, the verification process, and the potential consequences for the monarchy. Helena had covered major stories before, but never anything with this level of international attention. Every question would be analyzed, every word would be scrutinized, and every detail would be examined for weakness that could be exploited by those seeking to discredit the story. Ladies and gentlemen, Helena began, her voice clear and confident despite the pressure she felt. 3 months ago, the Guardian was contacted by a source within the palace security team. This individual provided us with documents, photographs, and audio recordings that revealed systematic corruption at the highest levels of the royal household. A reporter from the BBC immediately raised his hand. Ms. Price, how can you verify the authenticity of these documents? Isn't it possible that they've been fabricated by someone with a political agenda? Helena had expected this question first. We spent 6 weeks verifying every piece of evidence with independent experts. Bank records were confirmed through multiple financial institutions. Audio recordings were analyzed by forensic specialists. Document authenticity was verified through paper analysis, ink dating, and digital forensics. We also cross-referenced all information with public records and independent sources. What about the source? Called out a reporter from Sky News. Can you tell us anything about their motivation or background? Our source is a long-term employee of the royal household with an impeccable service record, Helena replied carefully. Their motivation appears to be genuine concern for the integrity of the monarchy and a belief that the public has a right to know about corruption in publicly funded institutions. As the press conference continued, Marcus watched from his safe house, feeling sick to his stomach as he saw himself described as the source and the whistleblower. These clinical terms didn't capture the human cost of his decision, the fear he felt for his family's safety, or the grief he experienced at losing his career and his identity. His phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. You've made a terrible mistake. This won't end well for you or your family. Marcus showed the message to Sarah, whose face went pale with fear. Maybe we should leave the country, Sarah whispered. Take the girl somewhere safe until this all blows over. Marcus shook his head. Running away won't solve anything. And if we disappear now, it will look like we're admitting the story was false. Back at the palace, Queen Elizabeth II sat in her private study, reading through copies of all the documents that had been published. At 97, her mind remained sharp, and she was able to understand immediately the full scope of what had been happening under her nose. Her most trusted advisors had been systematically betraying her trust, stealing from the crown, and planning to manipulate her family's future. The Queen's private secretary, David Chun, had been with her for nearly 20 years, and he had never seen her this angry. Her hands trembled slightly as she held the documents, but her voice remained steady and controlled. David, she said quietly, I want you to contact the Attorney General immediately. I want a full criminal investigation into these allegations. I want every bank account examined, every transaction traced, and every person involved held accountable. Your Majesty, David replied carefully, the legal implications of this could be extremely complicated. If we pursue criminal charges, it could drag the monarchy through years of court proceedings and media attention. The Queen looked up from the documents, her eyes flashing with the same determination that had guided her through 70 years on the throne. David, in my entire reign, I have never wavered from one fundamental principle. The crown serves the people, not the other way around. If people in my household have betrayed that principle, then they must face the consequences, regardless of the cost to our reputation. That evening, as news of the Queen's decision to support a full criminal investigation spread through the palace, several high-ranking officials began making urgent phone calls to their lawyers, their banks, and their personal security teams. The palace power struggle that had been hidden for years was now exploding into the open, and everyone involved knew that the next few weeks would determine not just their own futures, but the future of the monarchy itself. Marcus Thompson, the simple guard who had started it all, sat in his temporary home and wondered if he had just saved the crown or destroyed it forever. 2 weeks after the story broke, London's most prestigious law firm, Whitmore and Associates, became the epicenter of the most significant legal battle the monarchy had faced in centuries. The firm's senior partners had been retained by multiple parties involved in the scandal, creating a complex web of legal representation that would dominate headlines for months to come. Attorney General Margaret Thornfield stood before a packed courtroom, addressing Judge Harrison Blackwell in what would be the preliminary hearing for what media had dubbed the Palace Papers case. The courtroom was filled with journalists, legal observers, and members of the public who had won spots in a lottery system due to overwhelming interest in the proceedings. Your Honor, Thornfield began, her voice carrying the weight of historical precedent. The Crown versus Hartwell, Sterling, and Associates represents the first time in modern British history that sitting palace officials have been charged with systematic theft from the royal treasury, conspiracy to manipulate the line of succession, and treason against the Crown. The charges were staggering in their scope. Lord Chancellor William Hartwell faced 17 counts of theft, 11 counts of conspiracy, and 3 counts of treason. Defense Minister Rebecca Sterling faced similar charges, along with additional counts related to her role in illegal arms sales. 12 other palace officials, contractors, and external associates faced various charges ranging from money laundering to conspiracy to commit fraud. Marcus Thompson sat in the public gallery, wearing a simple dark suit that made him nearly invisible among the crowd. His wife, Sarah, sat beside him, her hand clasped tightly in his as they watched the legal process that his evidence had set in motion. Their daughters were at school, unaware that their father was watching the most important legal proceedings of their generation. The defense table was a study in contrasts. Hartwell's lawyer, the legendary Thomas Pemberton QC, projected confidence and authority as he reviewed his notes. Pemberton had never lost a high-profile case, and his reputation for dismantling prosecution witnesses was well known throughout the legal community. Sterling's representation came from the equally formidable Elizabeth Hawthorne QC, whose expertise in financial crimes had saved dozens of high-profile clients from prison sentences. Judge Blackwell, a stern man in his 60s with a reputation for running an absolutely fair but strictly controlled courtroom, called for opening statements. The prosecution's case would be presented first, and Assistant Attorney General Robert Chun rose to address the court. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Chun began, his voice clear and measured. Over the next several weeks, you will hear evidence of a conspiracy so vast and so audacious that it strikes at the very heart of our constitutional monarchy. The defendants didn't simply steal money, though they stole millions. They didn't simply abuse their positions, though they violated every oath they took. They attempted to manipulate the very succession of our crown, to decide through corruption and blackmail who would lead our nation. Chun walked to a large display screen that showed a timeline of the alleged crimes. The evidence will show that beginning in January 2023, Lord Chancellor Hartwell and Defense Minister Sterling began systematically diverting funds from the royal treasury into offshore accounts. But this was just the beginning. They used their positions to broker illegal arms sales, to manipulate defense contracts, and ultimately to plan the destruction of Prince Edward's reputation so that they could control his brother, the Duke of Cambridge, through financial blackmail. The prosecution's opening lasted nearly 2 hours, with Chen methodically outlining how Marcus Thompson's evidence revealed layer after layer of corruption. Bank records showing impossible increases in the defendant's personal wealth. Audio recordings of conversations about manipulating the succession. Documents outlining plans to fabricate war crimes allegations against Prince Edward. When Thomas Pemberton rose for the defense's opening statement, the courtroom fell completely silent. Pemberton's reputation preceded him, and everyone knew that he would not simply defend his client, but would attempt to dismantle the entire prosecution case. Members of the jury, Pemberton began in his distinctive, cultured voice, "You have just heard a story that sounds like a political thriller novel. Secret conspiracies, hidden bank accounts, plots against the royal family. It's exciting, it's dramatic, and it's completely false." Pemberton walked slowly toward the jury box, making eye contact with each juror as he continued. The prosecution's entire case rests on the word of a single individual. Marcus Thompson, a disgruntled security guard who had been passed over for promotion multiple times, who had financial difficulties, and who had a documented history of making unfounded complaints against his supervisors. The defense attorney pulled up Thompson's personnel file on the screen. Marcus Thompson was written up 6 times in his 15-year career for insubordination, for failing to follow proper protocols, and for what his supervisors described as paranoid behavior. He had applied for promotion to supervisor level 4 times and been rejected each time. His personal finances show significant debt, including 2 missed mortgage payments in the months before he made these allegations. Marcus felt his stomach drop as he listened to this character assassination. Every personal struggle, every professional disappointment was being used to discredit the evidence he had risked everything to provide. Pemberton continued his attack methodically. The documents that Mr. Thompson allegedly discovered could have been easily fabricated using modern technology. The audio recordings were made without proper chain of custody and could have been edited or manipulated. The bank records, while appearing legitimate, show transactions that have innocent explanations related to legitimate government business and personal investments. As the defense's opening statement continued, Marcus watched the jury's faces carefully. Several jurors who had seemed convinced by the prosecution's presentation now looked skeptical and uncertain. Pemberton's reputation for destroying prosecution cases was apparently well-deserved. Most importantly, Pemberton concluded, Lord Chancellor Hartwell has served the crown faithfully for 25 years. His record of service, his dedication to the monarchy, and his personal character are beyond reproach. The idea that he would suddenly become a traitor to everything he spent his life defending is not just unlikely, it's impossible. The first week of testimony focused on the financial evidence. Forensic accountants presented detailed analyses of bank records, transaction logs, and financial flows that painted a picture of systematic theft and money laundering. The prosecution's star witness was Dr. Amanda Foster, a former Bank of England auditor whose expertise in financial crimes had made her a sought-after consultant for major fraud cases. Dr. Foster spent 3 days walking the jury through the complex financial web that the defendants had allegedly created. "What we see here," she explained, pointing to a chart showing money flows between dozens of accounts, "is a classic example of layered money laundering. Funds are moved rapidly between multiple accounts, often in different countries, to obscure their origin and destination." The evidence was damning. Over 18 months, more than £2 billion had been moved through accounts controlled or influenced by the defendants. Some money had been diverted from defense contracts, some from royal household operational funds, and some from charitable foundations associated with the royal family. But Thomas Pemberton was ready. During his cross-examination of Dr. Foster, he systematically challenged every conclusion she had reached. "Dr. Foster," Pemberton began, his tone respectful but skeptical, "you've testified that these transactions represent money laundering. But isn't it true that moving government funds between accounts for operational purposes is completely normal and legal?" "In general, yes," Dr. Foster replied carefully. "But the pattern here suggests—" "I'm not asking what you think the pattern suggests," Pemberton interrupted politely. "I'm asking whether any individual transaction you've identified is, by itself, illegal." Dr. Foster was forced to admit that most of the individual transactions could have legitimate explanations. Pemberton spent hours getting her to acknowledge that her conclusions were based on assumptions about intent rather than clear evidence of criminal activity. The prosecution's case suffered another blow when their key witness, a bank employee who had allegedly helped set up some of the offshore accounts, suddenly refused to testify. James Mitchell, who worked for a private bank in Switzerland, had initially agreed to cooperate with British authorities. But when called to testify, his lawyer announced that Mitchell was asserting his rights under Swiss banking privacy laws and could not provide testimony without violating his country's financial secrecy regulations. Without Mitchell's testimony, the prosecution lost a crucial link between the defendants and the offshore accounts. The bank records showed the accounts existed and showed the money flows, but they couldn't definitively prove who had set up the accounts or who controlled them. Helena Price watched these developments from the press gallery with growing concern. The story she had published was true. She was absolutely certain of that. But the legal system required a higher standard of proof than journalism did. Technical legal challenges and procedural obstacles were threatening to derail the case despite the clear evidence of corruption. The situation became even more complicated when Prince Edward was called as a prosecution witness. The sight of a member of the royal family testifying in a criminal case was unprecedented in modern British history, and every major news outlet in the world provided live coverage. Prince Edward's testimony was powerful and emotional. He described his shock at learning about the corruption, his anger at being betrayed by people he had trusted, and his determination to see justice done regardless of the consequences for the royal family's reputation. Lord Chancellor Hartwell was more than an advisor. Prince Edward testified, his voice heavy with disappointment. He was someone I trusted with my family's most sensitive information, someone I turned to for guidance during difficult decisions. The idea that he was planning to destroy my reputation with fabricated allegations is not just a crime. It's a personal betrayal that cuts to the core of everything I believe about honor and loyalty. But Pemberton's cross-examination of Prince Edward was masterful. Without directly attacking a member of the royal family, he managed to suggest that Prince Edward's interpretation of events might be colored by personal disappointment and political pressure. "Your Royal Highness," Pemberton said with careful deference, "you've testified about conversations that you believe show criminal intent. But isn't it possible that these conversations were actually about legitimate concerns regarding your suitability for succession?" The question hung in the air like a bomb. Prince Edward's face flushed with anger, but he maintained his composure. "Are you suggesting that systematic theft from the Treasury is a legitimate concern about succession?" "I'm suggesting," Pemberton replied smoothly, "that discussions about the monarchy's future, about financial management, and about the challenges facing the royal family might sound sinister when taken out of context, but might actually represent the normal concerns of dedicated public servants." By the end of the second week of testimony, the prosecution's seemingly strong case was looking increasingly vulnerable. Technical challenges, missing witnesses, and effective defense strategies had created reasonable doubt about what had initially seemed like clear-cut evidence of corruption. Marcus Thompson left the courthouse each day feeling sick with worry. He had risked everything to expose the truth, but he was watching that truth being systematically dismantled by lawyers whose job was to protect the guilty. The evidence was real, the recordings were authentic, and the corruption was undeniable, but the legal system seemed incapable of recognizing what was right in front of it. The most devastating blow came at the end of the second week, when Judge Blackwell announced that he was considering a defense motion to exclude all of Marcus Thompson's evidence on the grounds that it had been obtained illegally. If that motion succeeded, the entire case would collapse, and the people who had betrayed the crown would walk free. The motion hearing that would determine the fate of Marcus Thompson's evidence took place on a gray Monday morning in November. Judge Blackwell's courtroom was packed to capacity as legal experts, journalists, and members of the public waited to learn whether the most significant royal corruption case in modern history would collapse on a legal technicality. Thomas Pemberton stood before the bench with the confidence of a man who had identified a fatal flaw in his opponent's case. The motion he had filed challenged the admissibility of all evidence obtained by Marcus Thompson, arguing that his access to classified documents, recordings made without consent, and copying of confidential files violated numerous privacy laws and employment regulations. "Your Honor," Pemberton began, his voice carrying the authority of 30 years of legal practice. "The prosecution's entire case is built on evidence that was obtained through systematic violations of privacy laws, employment agreements, and national security regulations. Mr. Thompson used his security clearance to access information he was not authorized to copy, record conversations without consent, and steal confidential documents from his employers. Pemberton gestured toward a thick folder of legal precedents on his table. British law is clear that evidence obtained through illegal means cannot be used in criminal proceedings, regardless of what that evidence might reveal. The prosecution cannot build a case on crimes committed by their own star witness. Assistant Attorney General Robert Chun rose to respond, knowing that his entire case hung in the balance. The legal challenge was technically valid. Marcus had violated numerous laws and regulations in gathering his evidence. But Chun believed that the public interest in exposing massive corruption outweighed those technical violations. Your Honor, Chun argued, the defense is asking this court to ignore evidence of treason, systematic theft, and conspiracy to manipulate the royal succession because that evidence was obtained by someone who violated employment policies. This is exactly the kind of situation where whistleblower protections and public interest exceptions should apply. Judge Blackwell listened carefully to both arguments, asking pointed questions about the scope of Marcus's access, the nature of the information he had gathered, and the legal precedents for excluding evidence obtained by whistleblowers. The hearing lasted 3 hours, with both sides citing complex legal precedents and constitutional principles. When Judge Blackwell finally announced that he would take the matter under advisement and deliver his ruling the following Friday, both sides knew that the entire case now hung on a single legal decision. If the evidence was excluded, Lord Chancellor Hartwell and Defense Minister Sterling would walk free. If it was admitted, the prosecution could continue building their case for what would be the most significant corruption convictions in British political history. Marcus Thompson spent that week in a state of suspended animation. He had done everything he could do. Now his fate, and the fate of the truth he had risked everything to reveal, rested in the hands of a judge who had to balance legal technicalities against the public interest. The pressure on Marcus's family had become unbearable. Their temporary safe house was under constant surveillance by private investigators hired by the defendants' legal teams. Their phone records were being examined, their financial history was being scrutinized, and every aspect of their lives was being invaded by people looking for ammunition to use against Marcus in court. Sarah Thompson had been forced to take leave from her job as a primary school teacher after parents complained that having the wife of that troublemaker teaching their children made them uncomfortable. 8-year-old Emma had been bullied at school by children repeating things they had heard their parents say about her father. The family's quiet, normal life had been completely destroyed. Maybe we should have stayed quiet, Sarah said one evening as they sat in their cramped temporary kitchen. Look what this has cost us. Look what it's cost the girls. Marcus looked at his daughters, who were doing homework at the small table, and felt his heart breaking. They didn't understand why their lives had been turned upside down, why they couldn't go home, or why other people seemed angry at their father for reasons they couldn't comprehend. But then Marcus thought about the recordings he had made, the documents he had copied, and the evidence of systematic betrayal of everything the royal family represented. Sarah, he said quietly, if we don't stand up to this kind of corruption, who will? If people like Hartwell and Sterling can steal billions and manipulate the succession without consequences, what kind of country are we leaving for Emma and Sophie? Friday morning arrived with unusual intensity. The courthouse was surrounded by protesters, both supporting and opposing Marcus Thompson. One group carried signs reading "Protect our whistleblowers" and "Thompson is a hero." Another group held banners declaring traitors don't deserve protection and loyalty over lawbreaking. Inside the courtroom, Judge Blackwell looked grave as he prepared to deliver what everyone knew would be the most important ruling of his career. The decision he made would not only determine the fate of this particular case, but would set a precedent for how British courts would handle whistleblower evidence in future cases involving national security and royal affairs. This court has spent considerable time reviewing the legal precedents, constitutional principles, and public interest considerations involved in this matter. Judge Blackwell began, his voice carrying unusual weight. The question before us is whether evidence obtained through violations of employment agreements and privacy laws should be admitted when that evidence reveals alleged crimes of extraordinary magnitude. The judge paused, looking around the packed courtroom. The defense correctly argues that Mr. Thompson violated numerous laws and regulations in obtaining this evidence. He accessed information beyond his authorized clearance, recorded conversations without consent, and copied confidential documents without permission. Under normal circumstances, such violations would render the evidence inadmissible. Marcus felt his heart sinking. The judge seemed to be building toward a ruling that would exclude his evidence and destroy the prosecution's case. However, Judge Blackwell continued, this court must also consider the extraordinary nature of the allegations revealed by this evidence. We are not dealing with routine employment disputes or minor policy violations. The evidence suggests systematic theft of public funds, conspiracy to manipulate the royal succession, and potential treason against the crown. The judge referred to his notes before continuing. British law recognizes that there are exceptional circumstances where the public interest in revealing serious crimes outweighs the technical violations committed by those who expose such crimes. The Public Interest Disclosure Act provides protection for workers who reveal wrongdoing, even when that revelation requires violating normal procedures. Marcus felt a surge of hope as the judge's reasoning became clear. Judge Blackwell was not simply looking at the technical legal issues. He was considering the broader implications of his decision. Furthermore, the judge said, this court notes that Mr. Thompson attempted to report his concerns through normal channels before taking more drastic action. The evidence shows that he first approached his immediate supervisors with questions about financial irregularities. When those concerns were dismissed or ignored, he escalated to higher-level officials. Only after his legitimate concerns were systematically ignored did he resort to gathering evidence independently. The courtroom was completely silent as Judge Blackwell approached his conclusion. After careful consideration of all legal precedents and constitutional principles involved, this court rules that the evidence gathered by Mr. Thompson is admissible. While his methods violated employment policies and privacy regulations, the public interest in exposing alleged crimes of this magnitude outweighs those violations. The reaction in the courtroom was immediate and dramatic. Supporters of Marcus Thompson erupted in cheers, while defense attorneys looked stunned by the ruling that had just destroyed their primary strategy. Journalists immediately began filing stories on their phones, knowing that this ruling would dominate headlines around the world. Thomas Pemberton immediately rose to request an appeal of the ruling, but Judge Blackwell denied the request. This case will proceed to trial with all evidence intact, the judge declared firmly. The jury will have access to all materials gathered by Mr. Thompson, and they will determine the credibility and significance of that evidence. Marcus Thompson felt tears of relief streaming down his face as Sarah squeezed his hand tightly. For weeks, he had watched as technical legal challenges threatened to derail the case. He had sacrificed everything to bring forward. Now, finally, the truth would have its day in court. But the defense team wasn't finished. Even with the evidence admitted, they still had powerful weapons in their arsenal. Over the following weeks, they systematically attacked the credibility of every prosecution witness, challenged the interpretation of every document, and presented alternative explanations for every suspicious transaction. The defense's strategy became clear during the testimony of Dr. Richard Ashford, a financial expert hired to challenge the prosecution's interpretation of the banking records. Dr. Ashford argued that the complex financial transactions that prosecutors called money laundering were actually sophisticated but legitimate methods of managing government funds across multiple jurisdictions. What the prosecution calls a criminal conspiracy, Dr. Ashford testified, I see as an innovative approach to international finance designed to maximize returns on government investments while maintaining appropriate security and oversight. The defense also presented character witnesses who testified to the defendant's long records of faithful service. Former prime ministers, retired military officers, and respected civil servants all testified that Lord Chancellor Hartwell and Defense Minister Sterling were dedicated public servants who would never betray their oaths of office. Perhaps most damaging to the prosecution was the testimony of Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, a psychological expert who analyzed Marcus Thompson's behavior and motivations. Dr. Morrison suggested that Marcus's actions were consistent with someone suffering from paranoid delusions, and that his interpretation of normal government activities as criminal conspiracies reflected psychological instability rather than genuine wrongdoing. Mr. Thompson's personnel file shows a pattern of increasingly paranoid behavior over several years, Dr. Morrison testified. He frequently reported suspicious activities that investigations revealed to be completely normal and legitimate. His supervisors noted that he seemed to believe that routine administrative decisions were part of larger conspiracies against him personally. The psychological evaluation was devastating because it provided a coherent, alternative explanation for Marcus's actions. Instead of being a heroic whistleblower exposing corruption, he could be portrayed as a mentally unstable employee whose paranoid delusions led him to misinterpret normal government activities as criminal conspiracies. As the trial entered its sixth week, the prosecution's case that had seemed so strong at the beginning was looking increasingly vulnerable. The defense had successfully challenged key pieces of evidence, discredited important witnesses, and presented alternative explanations for every allegedly criminal act. Helena Price, watching from a press gallery, began to worry that the truth she had published might not survive the legal process designed to determine guilt or innocence. The evidence was real, the recordings were authentic, and the corruption was undeniable, but the adversarial legal system seemed designed to create doubt rather than reveal truth. The turning point came when the prosecution called its final witness, Queen Elizabeth II herself. The decision to have the 97-year-old monarch testify was unprecedented and controversial, but Attorney General Thornfield believed that only the Queen's personal testimony could cut through the legal complexity and speak directly to the human cost of the alleged betrayal. When Queen Elizabeth entered the courtroom, every person present stood in respect. Despite her advanced age, she walked to the witness stand with the dignity and grace that had defined her 70-year reign. Her testimony would either save the prosecution's case or deliver its final blow. The future of British justice, the integrity of the monarchy, and the fate of everyone involved now rested on the words of an elderly woman who had dedicated her entire life to serving her people and protecting the institution she represented. The courtroom fell into absolute silence as Queen Elizabeth II raised her right hand and took the oath to tell the truth. At 97, she moved slowly but with unmistakable dignity, her voice still clear and strong as she swore to provide truthful testimony in the case that had shaken the monarchy to its core. Attorney General Margaret Thornfield approached the witness stand with the weight of history on her shoulders. Never before had a reigning British monarch testified in a criminal trial, and everyone in the courtroom understood that this moment would be remembered for generations. Your Majesty, Thornfield began with respectful formality. How long have you known Lord Chancellor William Hartwell? 25 years, the Queen replied, her voice steady despite her advanced age. He was appointed to my household in 1999, and I have worked closely with him on matters of state policy, constitutional questions, and the daily administration of royal duties. During those 25 years, did you trust Lord Chancellor Hartwell with sensitive information about the royal family, about government policy, and about matters of national security? Completely, the Queen answered without hesitation. The Lord Chancellor's position requires absolute trust. He has access to private communications between the monarch and the government, to confidential information about the royal family's personal affairs, and to sensitive matters that could affect national security if disclosed. Thornfield walked carefully through the Queen's relationship with each of the defendants, establishing how deeply integrated they were into the most sensitive aspects of the monarchy's operations. Defense Minister Sterling had been trusted with military secrets, financial information, and private family matters. The other defendants had all held positions requiring absolute loyalty and discretion. Your Majesty, Thornfield continued, when you first learned about the allegations published in The Guardian, what was your immediate reaction? The Queen paused, and, for a moment, her composed exterior showed a flash of the pain this betrayal had caused her. Disbelief, she said quietly. Then anger. Then a deep sadness that people I had trusted completely had apparently betrayed, not just me personally, but the institution I've spent my entire life serving. Did you order an investigation into these allegations? Immediately. I instructed the Attorney General to pursue a full criminal investigation regardless of the consequences for the royal family's reputation. If people in my household had committed crimes, they needed to face justice. The Queen's testimony continued for 2 hours, during which she described her shock at learning about the offshore bank accounts, her horror at discovering the plans to manipulate the succession, and her determination to ensure that justice was served. Her words carried the weight of 7 decades of constitutional monarchy, and even the most cynical observers in the courtroom seemed moved by her obvious sincerity. When Thomas Pemberton rose for cross-examination, he faced an unprecedented challenge. How do you cross-examine a monarch without appearing disrespectful? while still defending your client effectively. Pemberton's reputation had been built on aggressive questioning of witnesses, but this situation required a completely different approach. Your Majesty, Pemberton began with careful deference. You've testified about your trust in Lord Chancellor Hartwell. Over 25 years, did you ever have reason to question his loyalty or his judgment? Never, the Queen replied firmly. Until these allegations surfaced, I had complete confidence in his dedication to his duties. Is it possible, Pemberton continued delicately, that activities which appear suspicious when viewed in isolation might actually have innocent explanations when understood in the context of complex government operations? The Queen considered this question carefully before answering. Mr. Pemberton, I have been briefed extensively on the evidence in this case. I have reviewed the bank records, listened to the audio recordings, and examined the documents. While I desperately wanted to believe there were innocent explanations, the pattern of behavior revealed by this evidence is unmistakable. Pemberton tried a different approach. Your Majesty, might it be possible that your interpretation of this evidence has been influenced by the shock of the initial allegations and the media coverage that followed? For the first time during her testimony, the Queen's voice carried a note of steel. Mr. Pemberton, I have been making difficult decisions based on complex information for 70 years. I am quite capable of distinguishing between media speculation and factual evidence. The evidence in this case speaks for itself. When the Queen's testimony concluded, the impact on the courtroom was palpable. Several jurors appeared to be wiping away tears, and even some of the defense attorneys looked shaken. The personal testimony of a monarch who had dedicated her life to serving her country, describing the betrayal by people she had trusted completely, had cut through all the legal complexity and technical challenges that had dominated the trial. The prosecution rested its case the following day, and closing arguments began immediately. Robert Chen's final presentation to the jury was passionate and direct, stripped of the legal technicalities that had sometimes obscured the fundamental issues during the trial. Ladies and gentlemen, Chen addressed the jury. This case is ultimately very simple. The defendants stole money from the royal treasury. They used their positions to broker illegal arms deals. They planned to manipulate the succession to the throne through blackmail and fabricated accusations. They betrayed every oath they took, every principle they claimed to uphold, and every person who trusted them. Chen walked through the evidence systematically, but now he focused on the human story rather than the technical details. Marcus Thompson saw what was happening and tried to report it through proper channels. When he was ignored, he risked his career, his family's security, and his personal safety to ensure that the truth came to light. He didn't do this for money, for fame, or for revenge. He did it because he believed that the monarchy his family had served faithfully for generations was being destroyed from within. The defense's closing arguments were equally passionate, but took a completely different approach. Thomas Pemberton focused on reasonable doubt, on the possibility of alternative interpretations, and on the prosecution's reliance on evidence obtained through illegal means. The prosecution wants you to believe in a vast conspiracy involving dozens of people, millions of pounds, and years of planning, Pemberton argued. But conspiracy theories require evidence, not speculation. They require proof, not suspicion. And they require facts, not the paranoid delusions of a disgruntled employee whose own personnel file shows a pattern of making unfounded allegations. Pemberton's closing lasted 3 hours and systematically challenged every piece of evidence the prosecution had presented. He argued that the bank transactions had innocent explanations, that the audio recordings were taken out of context, and that the documents could have been misinterpreted or even fabricated. The jury deliberations lasted 4 days. During that time, London was gripped by speculation about the outcome. Betting shops took wagers on the verdict. Newspapers published daily analysis of the jury's possible thinking. Television news programs ran constant coverage of the crowd gathered outside the courthouse. Marcus Thompson spent those 4 days in a safe house, unable to eat or sleep as he waited to learn whether his sacrifice had been worthwhile. His decision to expose the corruption had already cost him his career, his home, and his family's peace of mind. If the defendants were acquitted, it would have all been for nothing. On Thursday afternoon, word spread through the courthouse that the jury had reached a verdict. Within an hour, the courtroom was packed with journalists, legal observers, and members of the public who had been following the case obsessively for months. Judge Blackwell entered the courtroom and called for order as the jury filed in. The foreman, a middle-aged woman who had served as a school administrator before retirement, stood to deliver the verdicts that would determine not just the fate of the defendants, but the future of public trust in British institutions. On the charge of theft from the royal treasury, how do you find the defendant William Hartwell? Guilty, Your Honor. The word hit the courtroom like a physical blow. After months of legal maneuvering, technical challenges, and character assassination, the jury had cut through all the complexity and found the evidence convincing. On the charge of conspiracy to manipulate the royal succession, how do you find the defendant William Hartwell? Guilty, Your Honor. On the charge of treason against the crown, how do you find the defendant William Hartwell? Guilty, Your Honor. The verdicts continued for 20 minutes as the jury found Hartwell guilty on all 17 charges, Sterling guilty on all 14 charges against her, and 11 of the 12 other defendants guilty on various counts. Only one defendant, a low-level administrative assistant who had been pressured into participating, was acquitted on the grounds that she had been coerced. Marcus Thompson felt tears streaming down his face as he listened to verdict after verdict of guilty. Sarah squeezed his hand tightly, and for the first time in months, he felt that the sacrifice had been worth it. The truth had survived the legal process, justice had been served, and the corruption that had threatened the monarchy had been exposed and punished. The sentencing hearing took place 2 weeks later. Judge Blackwell, who had guided the case through its complex legal challenges with fairness and dignity, now faced the task of determining appropriate punishment for crimes that had no real precedent in British legal history. Lord Chancellor Hartwell received 22 years in prison. Defense Minister Sterling received 18 years. The other defendants received sentences ranging from 2 to 15 years, depending on their level of involvement and cooperation with the investigation. But the most significant moment came when Judge Blackwell addressed the court about Marcus Thompson's role in the case. This court notes that none of these convictions would have been possible without the courage of Mr. Marcus Thompson, who risked everything to ensure that the truth came to light. While his methods violated employment policies and privacy laws, his actions ultimately served the highest principles of justice and public service. The judge continued, Mr. Thompson will face no criminal charges for his actions in gathering this evidence. Furthermore, this court recommends that he receive appropriate recognition for his service to the Crown and to the people of the United Kingdom. 6 months later, Marcus Thompson stood in the throne room of Buckingham Palace as Queen Elizabeth II presented him with the George Medal for exceptional bravery in protecting the interests of the Crown. The ceremony was attended by members of the royal family, government officials, and representatives from law enforcement agencies around the world who had praised the case as a model for addressing high-level corruption. Mr. Thompson, the Queen said as she pinned the medal to his chest, you have upheld the highest traditions of loyal service to the Crown. Your courage in exposing corruption within my own household has strengthened the monarchy and demonstrated that justice applies to everyone, regardless of their position or power. The scandal had indeed damaged the monarchy's reputation in the short term, but the Queen's decisive response and commitment to justice had ultimately strengthened public trust in the institution. Polls showed that the royal family's approval ratings had actually increased after the trials, as people respected the courage to hold corrupt officials accountable regardless of the personal cost. Marcus Thompson returned to work as head of security for a private company that specialized in protecting whistleblowers and investigating corporate corruption. His experience had made him uniquely qualified to help others who found themselves in similar situations, facing the choice between personal safety and moral responsibility. Helena Price won the Pulitzer Prize for international reporting for her coverage of the palace corruption scandal. In her acceptance speech, she spoke about the importance of protecting sources who risk everything to expose wrongdoing, and about the media's responsibility to pursue truth even when powerful people prefer that truth to remain hidden. The case established important legal precedents for whistleblower protection, for the admissibility of evidence obtained by insiders exposing corruption, and for the prosecution of high-level officials who abuse positions of trust. Law schools around the world began teaching courses on the case, and it became a standard reference point for discussions about the balance between national security, personal privacy, and the public's right to know about government corruption. But perhaps the most important outcome was the message it sent to anyone in a position of power, that no one, regardless of their status, connections, or influence, was above the law. The monarchy itself had been willing to endure the pain and embarrassment of public scrutiny to ensure that justice was served, setting an example that resonated far beyond the borders of the United Kingdom. Marcus Thompson never regretted his decision to expose the corruption, even during the darkest moments when his family's future seemed uncertain. Years later, when his daughters were old enough to understand what had happened, they expressed pride in their father's courage and integrity. Emma, who had been 8 years old during the trial, eventually studied law herself, inspired by her father's belief that ordinary people have a responsibility to stand up for what is right. The palace corruption scandal became a defining moment in British history, demonstrating that the principles of justice, accountability, and moral courage could prevail even against the most powerful conspiracies. And it all began with a simple security guard who believed that the truth was more important than his own comfort, and who proved that one person with enough courage could change the world.